Ever since the A's relocation rumors got really serious, one of the biggest questions brought up by fans and media surrounding the potential move was, are the A's actually going to spend money on players if and when they move? And now that they have shovels in the ground, they're planning on going to Las Vegas in 2028, the question has gotten even more serious. And it's a big topic since the A's have a young, exciting roster right now that, although is not winning a ton of games, they're showing that in the future, they could be a contender if they have the right resources. Now, this is a deep question, and I'm going to admit, I don't know any more than anyone else does. I don't have insider information about the A's, and I don't know if they're going to spend in Vegas. To be honest, nobody does, really, except for the people at the top, the ownership, the John Fishers of the world. They might know what the plan is once they get to Vegas, but fans and everyone else alike are only speculating, and there's plenty of chatter about it on both sides. A lot of people think that the A's won't spend. They'll stay to their stingy ways when they move to Las Vegas, as they've had a bottom payroll these past few years and beyond. But on the other hand, some people are optimistic that the A's might go deeper in their pockets and entertain the Las Vegas fans with an exciting roster that could compete for championships. I mean, Dave Kaval a few years ago touted the idea the president is no longer with the A's, so take it with a grain of salt. But to truly try to answer this question, we have to look back on the history, as like I mentioned, the A's have had a low payroll for a very long time. They're in the bottom three right now. They wanted to spend more money to still qualify for revenue sharing, so they went out and signed guys like Luis Severino. They extended Lawrence Butler and Brent Rooker, among other moves they made. But at the end of the day, the A's still have a pretty non-competitive payroll, and they've had such payroll basically since about 2021. And I say basically because in 2021, they still had a payroll in the back half, 23rd ranked payroll, but it was still higher than it was now, and that 2021 team was a playoff contender. They did not qualify for the playoffs, but they still had a pretty good roster of guys that could have made a big run if they didn't collapse at the end. But first, let's look back at the history of this problem. Why didn't the A's spend money when they were in Oakland, at least in the John Fisher era? The A's have had a variety of different ownership groups over the years. The Haas family, most recently winning the World Series in 1989. You know, back then, payroll wasn't as big as it was now. You didn't have guys like Shohei Ohtani making $700 million or Juan Soto making $800. It was a different story back then, maybe a bit more parity in the league. But nowadays, it feels like certain teams can spend a lot, and there's other teams like the A's, the Rays, the Rockies, the Pirates that just don't spend money. Let's look at the A's in particular. Why haven't they spent money on players? Now, the answer to this question is very subjective, so I'm not going to say that my answer is any righter than anyone else's. But my theory is that the A's move to Las Vegas or out of Oakland, wherever it could have been, was tunnel vision from the start. I feel that John Fisher and the ownership group, ever since he took over in the early 2000s, felt that a deal in Oakland just wasn't going to happen. So why should he have to go deep in his pockets, spend money on players, entertain the Oakland fan base when he can do the bare minimum? And, you know, on one hand, you might disagree with this because the A's still had some good years in the 2010s going into the 2020s, but they still were kind of banking off that Moneyball mentality. Those A's teams, 5-6 years ago that were competing for division titles, competing for wild card spots, were banking on a lot of cheap veterans and young prospects to carry the roster into the promised lands. Guys like Jed Lowry were kind of the veterans that were on cheap deals. Chris Davis is another one. But then you had the younger guys like Matt Olson, Matt Chapman. And you could look to the same idea 10, 12 years ago when the A's were competing during that era, when the Josh Donaldsons ruled the world and the Yoenis Cespedes were around. Those teams did not spend a lot of money either. More recently, this topic has gotten a lot more light because these last 3 years, the A's have either had the bottom payroll or the second to last ranked payroll from 2024 back to 2022. And on top of that, they haven't been contending whatsoever. And I just think that kind of speaks to the issue I've talked about. If you're John Fisher, if you're the A's ownership, you see Oakland and say, in these final years, why should we spend if we're gearing up for something bigger, if we're going to have to regenerate our fan base one way or another? And that's what's ultimately going to happen, because in reality, there are not a ton of A's fans from Oakland or even Sacramento that are going to stick with the A's. And if there are some, if you're the A's, you can't bank on that. You can't bank on these fans staying loyal to your team when you're moving. It's an unknown thing on the quantity right now, but the reality is when the A's move to Las Vegas, they are essentially an expansion team with a ton of baggage, because people aren't going to necessarily forget all of the stuff that happened those final years in Oakland when they moved to Vegas. Some people in Las Vegas will turn a blind eye to it. Others will say, well, maybe I don't want to attend a game right away because I'm very upset about the way the move was carried out in Oakland. And that probably will happen to a large sum of people. But I think as years go on, people will suddenly forget about some of the stuff that happened those final years, and the A's will garner support in Vegas if they stay competitive. Another thing to remember about the A's, especially those final years in Oakland, is that the A's were not a profitable team. They were a team that was banking off of revenue sharing money every single year, and it was working to a certain extent. The A's would roll in a lot of cash, sometimes $60 million or more, and John Fisher, could kind of sit back, do nothing, not have to go deep into his pockets, and still take home a large share of revenue because of the revenue sharing money. However, the A's still had a lot of things they had to spend on. They were playing off a lease at the Coliseum. Obviously, they have to spend some money on players at the minor and major league level. And so the A's were not necessarily a cash cow those final years. Because they weren't super profitable, and spending a lot of money on a payroll wasn't necessarily going to guarantee fans come anyways. Because of the Oakland Coliseum status, the fact that it's an old stadium, you have to compete with the Giants across town. For the A's, in their eyes, if you put yourselves in their shoes, it just didn't make a lot of sense for them to spend a lot of money. Now, if you're a fan, you obviously disagree with that. You want your team to go out every night and have a competitive edge and try to win games. And the A's, to a certain extent, would still do that. They would find these diamonds in the rough, like Brent Rooker, guys that were maybe overlooked their first time around that are now either stars or phenoms of tomorrow. But at the end of the day, the A's just have not operated like a winning team these past 20 plus years, and maybe even beyond that. I mean, I don't have to tell you that the A's have always prided themselves, at least in the 21st century, of being that small market money ball type team. David Force has done a phenomenal job with the resources he got. Billy Beane, the exact same thing. But those resources were never really guaranteed because of the fact that the A's didn't really see a ton of reason to spend. So what's next? Now they move to Vegas, where the support right now is not super big up front, but they are going to have a very fancy world-class venue that could cost $2 billion plus. That to me is the first time John Fisher is spending money, even though he is getting a deal of some sort on this stadium. Public funding from Nevada and Las Vegas will be given to him. But if you're John Fisher, you're either gonna spend money on the A's or sell the team, in my opinion, because it just would not make sense to invest $2 billion or around that into a team and just let them go to die. The A's made a very solid move at the deadline, trading Mason Miller to pick up the number 3 prospect in all of baseball, Leo DeVries of the San Diego Padres formerly. If I were the A's right now, playing at Sutter Health Park, a very hitter-friendly park if you're a pitcher, I would trade away every single pitcher you can that's not a prospect to get guys back like Leo DeVries. I mean, a lot of people were talking about the Mason Miller trade as classic A's not spending money, until you realize the A's got rid of JP Sears, who is definitely not young anymore, and Mason Miller, who's pushing 30, guys that are not going to get better in Sacramento, playing in a park that is very hard to pitch at because of the mound, because of the fact that it's a small ballpark. And they went ahead and got one of the top prospects in all of baseball. When the Mason Miller trade was rumored, I thought the A's had no leverage whatsoever because of that fact, and because of the fact that Severino is so disgruntled about the whole situation. But the A's went out and took a great prospect from the Padres, and I think that's going to help them going forward, especially considering that the A's don't have a great farm system. Most recently, I've seen it being in the back half in the 20s, ranked out of the 30 pools. But they have some of the top players in the league, like Jacob Wilson, Nick Kurtz, 2 guys who are playing on their rookie years right now and are taking the baseball world by storm. According to Baseball Reference, 5 of the A's top 6 WAR contributors are under 30 years old. The one exception is Brent Rooker, who is 30 and has a contract extension that will see him likely play in Vegas if he's not traded. So the A's will have team control over guys like Jacob Wilson, Kurtz, Lawrence Butler going into Las Vegas, and they won't necessarily have to rush to trade these guys and will want a sort of recognizable roster in theory. In layman's terms, the remainder of the A's tenure in Sacramento should act as a building block toward contending years in Las Vegas. They shouldn't rush to contend or sign big-name pitchers that aren't going to do well there. They should instead build up their prospect pool on both the hitting and pitching sides. So to break it down simply, the A's in Oakland did not see reason to spend money on players because I honestly think they knew they were going to move. If you look at a lot of the different eras of the A's stadium saga over the years, there has really never been a time that they've been super close to getting a stadium built because of logistical issues. You look at Howard Terminal. It was a great plan in theory. There were a lot of people on board with it. I personally wanted that plan to happen, but logistically, it was very tough. You're building on very valuable waterfront land. Obviously, the port is very lucrative. You're not too far from there. You're also having to deal with other companies getting in the way, trying to stop it. There were steel companies around the area. And the fact that the plan was just so expensive, a $12 billion plan. The stadium itself was not $12 billion. However, the A's had a lot of ideas to revitalize the area that would have cost a lot of money. The Peralta site fell through. The A's didn't get the proper approval. The Coliseum City plan had a lot of flaws. Every single one of the A's stadium plans in the Bay Area, or Oakland specifically, and I say Bay Area because Fremont and San Jose existed as ideas, had flaws, and that's why they weren't built. And some of that is the A's fault. A lot of it is. Some of that is just California or building in a very lucrative area like the Bay Area. I mean, the Giants nearly moved away. That's how tough it is to build stadiums in the Bay Area. I mean, the Niners moved to Santa Clara. You get my point. It is hard to build stadiums in the Bay Area. That's why teams move. Part of it is ownership. Part of it is just the landscape being very difficult. Both sides have their issues. If you're the A's and you can build up enough prospects heading into Vegas, create some excitement, and then supplement those young players with the needed veterans to compete for a championship, that might motivate fans to actually go to games there, because we don't really know what the scene is like. And I say we in the Bay Area don't really know what the fanfare is like in Las Vegas yet. But if the A's can generate enough fan support in Las Vegas, then that maybe, just maybe, will spark them to spend more money in Sin City, because they'll have, to them, more reason to playing at a facility that costed John Fisher and the ownership group a lot of money to build, and the fact that the A's, in their minds, will have a chance to be truly lucrative and able to generate revenue. Before I close this out, I just want to say, I totally wish the A's spent money in Oakland. I do not subscribe to the belief that they had no reason to, and that was valid. I just think that's my theory about why they didn't spend money in Oakland. And as a lifelong A's fan, I always wanted them to spend in Oakland, get a championship for the city, because it always felt in my childhood and going into my adult years that they were so close, just a few pieces away from being a contender, with how genius the front office was and how good they were at generating prospect players out of thin air. Guys like Matt Chapman or Matt Olson, who weren't necessarily seen super highly when they were drafted as these future stars, and now got really big contracts because the A's really turned them into these great players. We see teams like the Dodgers spend hundreds of millions of dollars on payroll and win championships and be contending for ones perennially, whereas the A's have had contending years this past few decades, but have kept their payroll toward the bottom. A recent report had the A's spending $77 million in 2025. Obviously, that number fluctuates a lot, especially with the recent trade deadline, but that is a bottom payroll, and if they want to move to Vegas and have a lot of support, that will likely have to change. Now, like I said at the beginning, this is a very controversial subject, one that everyone seems to have a different opinion on, so let me know your thoughts in the comments. Are the A's going to spend in Vegas? Is John Fisher going to sell the team and be done with them altogether? Let me know your thoughts. Once again, thank you for watching this video. My name is Casey, and I appreciate you tuning in.